It's beyond repair. Three technicians standing near the lift bay laughed when they saw the battered old car roll through the open garage door slow, limping, trailing a faint curl of smoke from somewhere beneath the hood. The rain came down in sheets that Tuesday afternoon, and the woman behind the wheel wore a black blazer that probably cost more than any of the cars currently in the shop. She stepped out without a word, her heels clicking against the wet concrete floor, her expression unreadable, in the way that belongs only to people who have long ago learned to stop showing the world what they actually feel. The car was a crumpled front quarter panel, a spider web crack across the passenger side mirror, deep scrapes running the length of the driver's door, as though the vehicle had been dragged sideways along a guardrail. Which, in fact, it had. The woman said nothing about that. She only stood beside the car with her arms folded and waited. One of the younger technicians walked a slow circle around the vehicle, tapping a ballpoint pen against his clipboard, doing the theater of assessment without doing the work of it. The garage was one of the most reputable in the city, or at least it advertised itself that way, on roadside billboards and radio spots, and the kind of glossy brochures left fanned across waiting room tables. It was called Renner and Sons Automotive, though the Sons had long since moved to other cities and other lives. And Renner himself was a heavy-set man named Gary, who wore his authority the way men in certain rooms always do, loudly, without being asked. Gary came out from the glass-walled office at the back of the shop floor and took one look at the car, one look at the woman, and decided immediately that he understood the situation. He smiled the smile of a man who has already made up his mind. The car, he explained, crossing his arms and rocking slightly on his heels, was what the industry would call a total loss. The frame damage alone would cost more to repair than the vehicle was worth on any market in any state. He used words like structural compromise and cost-prohibitive restoration and end-of-life assessment. He said them with a kind of professional satisfaction, the way men like him always do when they get to use their expertise to close a door. One of the other mechanics made a comment under his breath, something about people who hold on to old cars the way they hold on to old relationships. Past the point of reason, past the point of return. The laughter that followed was short and low, meant to be heard just enough. The woman's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Almost. She looked at the car for a long moment, and the look on her face was not the look of someone being told their property was worthless. It was the look of someone being told a person they loved was gone. Gary added, for good measure, that there were salvage operations that paid fair prices for vehicles like this, meaning vehicles that had become more useful for their parts than for their purpose. He said the word salvage the way certain people say certain words, as though the recommendation itself was a kindness being extended, a practical mercy. The woman did not respond. She stood in the rain smell of the open bay with her eyes fixed somewhere between the crumpled hood and a point located approximately 11 years in the past, and she said nothing at all. At the far end of the garage, near the corner where the mop bucket sat and the shelving held spare rags and cleaning supplies, an older man had been working quietly the entire time. He was perhaps 65, perhaps older, the kind of age that becomes hard to pin because the person wearing it has become indifferent to the question. He wore the gray uniform of the cleaning staff and pushed a wide mop across the oil-stained floor in long, methodical strokes. No one looked at him. No one spoke to him. He was the furniture of the room present, useful in a background way, invisible in every way that the room's main actors were concerned. But as the three mechanics laughed and Gary delivered his verdict, the old man had stopped moving. He stood at the edge of his work, the mop handle resting loosely in both hands, and he was looking at the car with eyes that held something the others in that room did not carry. Recognition. Not the casual recognition of a man who knows cars generally, something more specific, more personal, the way a person recognizes handwriting they haven't seen in decades, but whose particular slant and pressure they will never entirely forget. He looked at the badge beneath the grime, tilted his head slowly to one side, and something shifted behind his expression. Something old and careful and significant. He didn't say anything yet. He wasn't ready, but his hands, resting on the mop handle, had gone very still. The woman's name was Claire Ashford, She was the founder and chief executive of Meridian Technologies, a company valued at somewhere north of $4 billion depending on the quarter and the temperament of the market. She had been on the cover of 3 national business publications in the past 18 months. She had testified before a Senate subcommittee about data infrastructure. She had been described in one profile as relentlessly precise, and in another as the kind of executive who makes other executives feel like they haven't been paying attention. None of this was visible in the garage. What was visible was a woman standing beside a damaged car in the rain, holding herself very still, fighting something that had nothing to do with business, and everything to do with a Tuesday afternoon, many years ago when she was 12 years old, and her father had walked her around this very car in a small garage that smelled of oil and iron and possibility, and told her that someday, when she was old enough to understand patience, they would bring it back together. Her father's name had been Robert Ashford. He had been a mechanic. He had worked with his hands his entire life, and he had loved this car, a 1967 Shelby GT 500, one of fewer than 2,000 ever produced, purchased at auction in the early 1990s when her father was young and hopeful, and convinced that beautiful broken things could always be made whole again. She had grown up with the car in various states of partial assembly, an engine here, a body panel there, the upholstery stripped and waiting for the day the money was right and the time was long enough. The day never quite arrived. Her father worked long hours. She worked long hours. She built a company. And her father told everyone he met about it, with a pride she could hear in his voice from across 3 time zones, and the car sat in a climate-controlled storage unit, accumulating the kind of careful dust that accrues when something is being preserved for a future that keeps receding. When Robert Ashford died of a cardiac event on a Thursday morning 4 years ago, the car was the first thing Claire thought about, not because it was valuable, not because she had any particular sentimental attachment to automobiles as a category of object, because it was his, and because the promise they had made to each other about it, the vague, warm, perpetually deferred promise of some weekend, when they would both be less busy, and the garage would be theirs, and they would begin was now permanently beyond keeping. She had put the car back into storage after the funeral. She had not been able to look at it for 2 years. In the 3rd year she had arranged, with the focused practicality she brought to all difficult things, to have it transported to a specialist restoration shop several hours north. She had been driving it slowly, gently, on the mountain road, the most direct route, when the deer came out of the tree line at speed, and she swerved, and the guardrail did what guardrails do. Nobody was hurt. The car took the damage, and now she stood in Renner and Sons while Gary Renner delivered his verdict, and the mechanics laughed, and she understood with the cold clarity of someone who has survived many rooms full of men who underestimated her that this garage would not be the place where her father's car was saved. She was about to say so calmly, precisely, in the way she said things that left no room for misinterpretation, when she noticed the old man in the gray uniform. He was not laughing. He was not looking at his mop. He was looking at the car the way no one else in that room was looking at it. He was looking at it the way her father used to. Gary Renner was in the middle of explaining the logistics of selling the vehicle to a salvage operation when one of his regular clients walked through the front door, a man named Douglas Hartwell, who owned 3 car dealerships and a marina, and who recognized Claire Ashford immediately because he had sat across from her at a charity gala the previous spring, and had spent most of that evening trying to impress her with his investment portfolio. He stopped mid-sentence to stare. Then he took out his phone. He didn't ask permission. He never did. Within 40 minutes, photographs of the crumpled vehicle and its owner had been shared widely enough that a junior associate at Claire's company was texting her communications director with the words, "We have a situation." Within an hour, Gary Renner had done something that would define the quality of his character more precisely than any certification on his wall. He had called a contact at a local news blog and offered to describe the car, the damage, and the owner in exchange for what he called a bit of publicity for the shop. He framed it as human interest. The blog framed it as spectacle. By early evening, the phrase "billion-dollar CEO brings junk car to body shop" was circulating in the way that only embarrassing things circulate, fast, gleeful, and without mercy. The timing was catastrophic. Meridian stock had been volatile for 6 weeks, following a product delay that the financial press had already decided was evidence of deeper organizational problems. The last thing Claire's board needed was optics of their CEO appearing eccentric or sentimental or untethered from rational decision-making. 3 board members called her before nightfall. She answered none of them. She was still there because of something that had happened in the hour after Douglas Hartwell had taken his photograph. She was still there because the old man in the gray uniform had set down his mop, walked to the front of the car, crouched beside the grill, and done something quiet and deliberate that none of the mechanics noticed until it was already done. He had placed one hand against the crumpled hood and closed his eyes, briefly, the way a person does when they are listening rather than looking. Then he had stood up and walked to Gary's office door and knocked twice, and Gary had looked at him the way people like Gary always look at people whose uniforms denote function rather than status, and the old man had said, very simply and without apology, "I think I know this car." The garage had gone quiet in the particular way that spaces go quiet when someone has said something that violates the assumed order of things. Gary blinked. One of the mechanics set down a wrench. The old man held Gary's gaze with the patience of someone who has learned not to need the other person to catch up quickly. Gary said something dismissive close to "That's very helpful, Walter," and then laughed. And 2 of the mechanics laughed with him, because that is what happens in rooms with a clear hierarchy and a man at the top who has signaled what the correct response to a challenge should look like. The old man's name was Walter Briggs. Claire did not know this yet. She only knew that he had not laughed, that he had not retreated, that he was still standing in Gary's doorway, with the composure of someone who has been underestimated so many times that the experience no longer registers as an insult, only as a delay. He spoke again, more specifically this time. He said the year, the model variant, the production sequence. He said the engine displacement and the original transmission configuration and the specific casting marks on the block that would be visible only if you knew where to look and had a reason to look there. He said these things the way someone recites a home address from memory, without effort, as basic fact. The garage went from quiet to something closer to stunned. Gary's smile had not entirely disappeared, but it had changed shape. Claire stepped forward. "How do you know that?" she asked. Walter Briggs looked at her for a moment before answering. "I helped design it," he said. "There are revelations that arrive loudly, and there are revelations that arrive the way this one did in 6 words, spoken without drama, in a garage that smelled of solvent and rain." Claire said, "Show me." And Walter said, "Open the hood." What followed in the next 20 minutes left Gary and his technicians standing at an uncomfortable distance, listening to Walter Briggs describe the internal architecture of a 1967 Shelby, with the specificity of a man reading from his own memory, because it was, in fact, his own memory. He identified the components that had been incorrectly replaced at some point in the vehicle's history, a distributor from a different model year, a carburetor that was close but not correct, a bracket in the firewall that had been welded rather than bolted, and was therefore wrong by the standards of someone who had been in the room when the original specification was written. He pointed to a small stamping on the inner fender well, partially obscured by decades of accumulated grime, and said, "That's the production identifier. There were fewer than 40 of this specific configuration ever assembled." He paused. Then, "You are not looking at a car that is beyond repair. You are looking at a car that your technicians are not qualified to repair." No one in the room said anything for a long moment. Gary opened his mouth and closed it again. Walter turned to Claire and said, with the directness of someone who has stopped performing courtesy in favor of something more useful, "Do you want this car fixed? Yes or no?" Claire said yes without hesitation. Walter nodded once. "Then come back tonight, after the shop closes." What no one in that garage knew, not Gary, not the mechanics, not Douglas Hartwell, not the journalists who were already assembling the wrong story, was that Walter Briggs had not always carried a mop. He had, for 14 years, been the chief restoration engineer at a firm called Hargrove Classics, which was not a firm that advertised itself to the general public because it did not need to. It existed at the specific intersection of wealth and obsession that generates the kind of commissions most automotive restorers never see. Prototype vehicles, racing provenance, documented one-offs, the sort of machines that end up in temperature-controlled vaults belonging to people for whom the concept of market value is something that applies to investments they do not care about. Walter had been, within that world, considered one of the finest minds working in vehicle restoration in the country. He had overseen projects that now appeared in auction catalogs under estimates that required multiple commas. He had been, for a period, genuinely irreplaceable. And then he had left. The circumstances of his departure were known to very few people, and none of them were in this garage. What was known, to the one older mechanic at Renner & Sons, who had once worked adjacent to that world, was that Walter Briggs had simply stopped, had surfaced, years later, doing maintenance work and cleaning floors, and living in a way that the people who once knew his name found confusing and a little sad. Which said more about them than it did about Walter. The older mechanic had not said any of this in the moment because he had not been certain. He was certain now, watching Walter work the latch on the hood with the practiced ease of someone who has performed this motion 10,000 times on exactly this kind of vehicle, and he felt something that was not quite shame but lived in the same neighborhood. What Walter himself knew, and what he had never explained to anyone who pushed, was that he had left because of a car. Not a valuable car, not a historically significant prototype, a 1963 Galaxy that had belonged to his wife, Margaret, who had died in the spring of the year he resigned. He had been in the middle of restoring it for her, had promised her, in the specific way that people promise things to the people they love, that it would be finished before her birthday. It was not finished. She died before her birthday. And Walter, who could have finished the car, who had every tool and skill and resource required, had found that he could not, that in the weeks after Margaret died, he went to the garage and stood in front of the Galaxy and felt nothing that resembled competence, felt only the specific cruelty of being very good at a thing and having the one person for whom that goodness mattered be gone. He had sold the car, unfinished, and left. He had not worked on a vehicle in a professional capacity since. That was 11 years ago. He cleaned floors because the work was simple and asked nothing from him that he was not prepared to give. And because he was not, he had long believed, going to return to the other thing. Not until the Tuesday afternoon, when a woman drove a crumpled 1967 Shelby into a garage in the rain, and every mechanic in the room called it a lost cause, while Walter looked at the badge in the grime and felt, very quietly, something shift. They worked 3 nights in the rented bay, Claire paying Gary Renner for after-hours access at a rate that Gary accepted without argument. Because Gary, whatever else he was not a man who turned down a number like that. Walter came after his shift ended, changed into different clothes, and worked. He brought his own tools, carried in a leather roll he kept in the trunk of his car, and the sight of those tools worn, precise, obviously very old, and very deliberately maintained, told Claire more about Walter Briggs than any amount of explanation would have. On the first night he worked mostly in silence, and she watched, and understood without being told that what she was observing was not a performance of competence, but competence itself, the real and unhurried kind, that does not need an audience to verify it. On the second night she began to help in small ways, handing tools when he named them, holding a light, learning to read the specific quality of pause that meant he was listening to something in the car rather than deciding something in his head. He did not explain much, but when he talked about the car, he talked about it the way scholars talk about texts they have spent their lives with, not summarizing but inhabiting, noting the places where the original intention and the eventual execution had come apart, and the places where they had been, against all expectation, unified. He said once that restoration was not about returning something to function, but about returning something to truth. Claire heard this and said nothing for a long time, because she recognized the distinction from her own work. From the 15 years she had spent building a technology company on the precise difference between making something work and making something right. She had never heard anyone outside that world articulate the same idea with the same precision and the same quiet conviction. On the fourth night, everything nearly came apart. She arrived to find Walter standing in the center of the bay with his arms at his sides, and an expression she had not seen on him before. Still, but with something underneath the stillness that was not peace. He told her, without preamble, that a component was missing. A specific part, the original intake manifold that he had identified and carefully set aside 2 nights earlier. It was gone. The tool cabinet had been moved. The notes he had made on a legal pad were also gone. He looked at Claire and said, "Someone in this building knows what this car is worth, and has decided to act on that knowledge." Claire stood very still for a moment. Then she looked at Gary Renner's glass-walled office at the back of the shop, the lights off, the blinds angled closed against the night. She said, "He called an auction house." Walter nodded slowly. "That would be my guess." She sat down on an upturned crate and pressed her hands flat against her thighs, and for the first time since she had walked into this garage, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of the situation. Not the professional exposure, not the stock price, not the board members whose calls she had ignored. The weight of the car. The weight of what it meant that someone in this room had looked at the thing her father had spent his life loving and seen only a transaction. She said, "Maybe they were right. Maybe it can't be done." It was the only moment in those 4 nights when she said something she did not entirely believe, and Walter heard the disbelief in it, which is why he did not answer the statement directly. Instead, he said, "My wife had a car. I promised I would finish it for her." He told her nothing else. He did not need to. Claire looked up at him. "And?" she said. "And I didn't," he said. "I have not touched a car since then." He paused. Until now, the space between those 2 sentences was 11 years long, and Claire understood that the distance she was being shown was not smaller than her own. The black truck arrived at 11:47 at night, and it was not Gary Renner's doing, though Gary had tried. It was the doing of a man named Preston Cole, who ran the North American division of a private auction firm, and who had received, 3 days earlier, a photograph sent from a phone registered to one of Gary's technicians, along with a description that made Preston Cole get out of bed and pour himself a drink and stand at his window for a long time. Preston arrived with 2 associates and a woman named Dr. Kathleen Marsh, who was a provenance specialist and who studied the car for less than 4 minutes before she said, in a tone that suggested she was reporting a fact rather than expressing amazement, "This is the Ashford prototype." The men who had come with Preston exchanged looks. Kathleen crouched beside the car and pointed to the stamping on the inner fender that Walter had identified 4 days earlier. "This is one of the pre-production test builds from the '66 Shelby program. There were believed to be fewer than 6 in existence. 3 are documented. 1 was destroyed in a fire. 2 are unaccounted for." She stood up. "This is one of the 2. She looked at Walter, who was standing at the edge of the light with his arms folded, and she stopped. She looked at him more carefully. Then she said, "Walter Briggs," not as a question, as a statement of fact delivered with the particular weight of someone encountering a person they believed they would never see again. Walter said her name back, Kathleen. Preston Cole had arrived by then, called by his own associate who had recognized the significance of what they were looking at, and he turned to Claire Ashford and said that the vehicle in front of them, properly restored, would be one of the most significant, privately held American automobiles in existence. He named a number. It required multiple commas. Gary Renner made a sound that was not quite a word. Claire Ashford looked at Walter Briggs and thought. He knew. From the moment he walked to the front of this car in the rain and placed his hand on the crumpled hood and closed his eyes, he knew exactly what it was. He said nothing in front of Gary's mechanics, not because he lacked confidence, but because he understood, with long experience, which rooms are worth speaking into and which are not. The missing intake manifold had been taken by one of Gary's technicians on Gary's instruction and delivered to Preston Cole's associate as collateral for a deal Gary had been quietly assembling for 3 days. The deal collapsed in the moment. Preston Cole understood that the owner of the vehicle was not a sentimental woman who didn't know what she had, but was in fact the founder of a $4 billion technology company who was currently standing in the room, watching the conversation unfold with the calm attention of someone who records everything. Gary attempted several things in rapid succession: an explanation, an apology, a reframing of his role in events that would have required the assembled witnesses to have very short memories and very low expectations of logic. None of it landed. Claire did not raise her voice, in the tone she used in boardrooms when precision mattered and patience had reached its boundary. "Return the part. Tonight." Gary returned the part. Preston Cole offered, before he left, to oversee the sale of the vehicle at whatever point Claire decided she was ready. She thanked him and said she would consider it. She was not considering it. Walter watched the truck disappear into the dark, and then turned back to the car and said, without turning around, "We lost 2 days." Claire said, "Can we get them back?" He said, "I'll need a different carburetor. And more time." She said, "You have both." He turned around and looked at her and said, "The work itself is all I want for this." She said, "I know." She had understood that, since the second night. The engine turned over on a Thursday morning just before dawn, in the second week of their work. It caught, held, settled into a sound that Walter Briggs had not heard in 30 years, a sound that was, in its specificity, unlike any other sound in the category of engines. A deep and even and entirely particular note that belonged only to this configuration. This displacement, this moment in the history of what human hands and human knowledge can produce when they are applied to something worth preserving. Claire sat in the driver's seat with both hands on the wheel and said nothing for a very long time. The car ran. It ran the way it had been designed to run, with the authority and the precision and the entirely unreasonable beauty of something made by people who understood that the difference between good and right is everything. Walter stood at the open bay door, looking out at the dark parking lot and the first pale suggestion of morning on the edge of the sky, and felt the thing he had not felt in 11 years, which was not pride exactly, and not grief exactly, but something that contained both, and transcended both the feeling of having done a hard thing correctly, of having returned something to truth, of being, finally, equal to the weight of a promise. Gary Renner came by later that morning. He had heard. He stood at the edge of the lot, in the early light, and looked at the car, gleaming and whole now, parked outside the bay with the sun catching its curves, and he said something about being sorry and about having misjudged things. Claire Ashford looked at him for a moment. She said, "You saw scrap metal." He saw memory. She said it without anger, which was perhaps the most devastating thing about it. It was not a judgment. It was simply a distinction between the quality of attention that Gary Renner brought to the world and the quality that Walter Briggs brought to it, and how that difference had determined everything about the past 2 weeks. Gary nodded slowly and said nothing more. She found the photograph that afternoon, in the glove compartment, slipped into a yellowed envelope she had somehow missed in all the years she had kept the car in storage. It was a Polaroid, creased at one corner, slightly faded. 2 young men standing in front of a car on a lift in some garage that was not this garage, both of them grinning with the unguarded happiness of people who have not yet accumulated enough of life to know that it requires guarding. She recognized her father instantly, Robert Ashford at perhaps 30, leaner than she remembered him, holding a wrench like a trophy. The other man was younger, barely 20-something, with the same careful stillness in his eyes that she had recognized across 40 years, and a shop floor and a mop handle. She carried the photograph to where Walter was packing his tools and held it out without speaking. He looked at it for a long time. His hands went very still. "Bobby," he said, just the one word, just the name. Then he looked up at Claire, and there was something in his face that she had not seen there before, something open, something that had been kept carefully closed for a very long time and had just, in this moment, in the ordinary morning light of a parking lot, come open. "We designed the first iteration of the engine mounts together," he said. "In the summer of '66, I was an apprentice. He was already the best mechanic I had ever seen." He paused. "I didn't know it was his car. I knew the car knew every curve and casting and specification because I had worked on the prototype program. But I didn't know Robert Ashford was the man who had it." He looked at the photograph again. He must have acquired it after I lost track of him. After I left the industry, Claire said, "He never mentioned you." Walter said, "No. Bobby wasn't a man who talked about the past much. He believed in forward." She heard in the words something that was not information but was something more important, the particular music of one person having known another person very well, long ago, and loved what they found. "There's a signature on the underside of the intake manifold," Walter said quietly. "Under a weld. Your father's handwriting. I recognized it on the first night." Claire looked at him. "That's how you knew," she said. He nodded. "That's how I knew it wasn't beyond repair." She did not offer him money again. She offered him something he had not been expecting, and which, from the expression on his face, he did not immediately know what to do with. She told him about the fund she intended to establish a training program for young mechanics, built inside the framework of Meridian's corporate foundation, with a specific focus on restoration work and the preservation of vehicles with historical significance. She told him that she intended to keep the old garage space Renner & Sons, once its current management situation had been resolved, and convert it into a working educational facility. She told him that she needed someone to help design the curriculum, someone who understood that the work was not about machines but about what machines carry. Someone who knew the difference between repair and restoration. Walter was quiet for a long time. He had packed all his tools. He was, visibly, a man who had already decided to leave, had intended to get in his car and return to the life he had assembled from the pieces of the one that had broken. He turned the proposition over in the silence, and Claire did not fill the silence, because she had learned that from him across the past 2 weeks. The patience of someone who knows that a thing that is taking time is not a thing that is failing. Finally, Walter said, "I'll think about it." She said, "Take your time." He said, "I've had quite a lot of that." She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it changed her face completely, made her look, for a moment, like the 12-year-old girl who had stood beside this same car in a different garage and been told by a man she loved that beautiful broken things could always be made whole again. He left before full daylight. She watched his car pull out of the lot and turn north, into the kind of morning that arrives after difficult nights, carrying the tentative brightness of something that has come through intact. She stood for another few minutes, her hand resting on the Shelby's roof, feeling beneath her palm the warmth that the early sun had already begun to raise from the metal. She thought about her father, who had looked at this car at auction when he was young and seen not what it was, but what it could become. She thought about Walter Briggs, who had walked away from a life's work because the person for whom he did that work was gone, and who had come back not for money, not for reputation, not for any of the things that the world usually accepts as sufficient reason. She thought about what it costs to carry something, a car, a career, a grief, a promise, and what it might cost to set it down correctly, in the right place, at the right time, for the right reason. The engine idled. She had left it running. It idled with a sound that was complete and certain and entirely itself. And that sound moved through the morning air and through her in a way that was not dramatic and did not need to be, because the deepest kinds of repair are always quiet. She got in. She drove north on the coast road with the windows down, and the sun came fully over the water, and the engine held its note, the note that 2 young men had worked out together in a garage in the summer of 1966, while the world outside did whatever the world does, and 2 people paid attention to something they believed was worth the attention. There are things the world calls worthless, she thought, only because it has not heard the story behind them, only because it has not been told what the hands that made them were trying to say. She drove until the road curved and the sea appeared on her left, wide and lit and going on without end. And she let the car have its full voice in the open air. It was exactly the sound her father had always said it would be. It was better than she had imagined. It was enough. There was a moment, sometime in the middle of the second night, when Claire Ashford stopped pretending she was there purely for logistical reasons. She had told herself, when she agreed to Walter's arrangement, that this was a practical decision, after-hours access, a skilled hand, a path forward on a problem that the daylight hours and the regular mechanics had failed to solve. She had told herself that she was managing the situation the way she managed all situations, by identifying the most competent available resource and deploying it. But somewhere around 1 in the morning, with the fluorescent lights casting their flat white wash across the bay, and Walter working the engine compartment, with a focus so complete it had its own gravity, she found herself sitting on the floor, with her back against the car's rear quarter panel, still wearing her blazer, her shoes set neatly beside her, and she was not managing anything. She was watching, she was breathing, she was doing something she had not done in a very long time, which was to be in a room, and not be the most urgent thing in it. The sensation was strange enough that she noticed it, and noticing it opened something not dramatically, not with any particular release of feeling, but in the way that a small window opened in a room that has been sealed for a season, lets in, without fanfare, the current of the outside air. She had built her company in the years immediately following her father's decline. The years when he was still alive, but she could feel the diminishment in his voice, and she worked harder, always harder, as though velocity were a form of protection. When he died, she went back to work within 3 days. She did not know another way to hold grief. She had been holding it the same way for 4 years, which is to say, by not holding it at all, by keeping her hands full of other things, by being in enough rooms that there was never quiet long enough for the weight to find her. This room, at 1 in the morning, with the rain finally stopped, and Walter working in silence, and the old car opened up around its own history, was quiet in exactly the way she had been avoiding. Walter set down a tool and looked at her over the engine compartment. "You don't have to stay," he said. Not unkindly. Not as a suggestion that she should leave, only as a recognition that she was choosing to be there. "I know," she said. He looked at her for another moment. "You're like him," he said. "Bobby. He used to sit on the floor of the shop when the work got difficult. He said it helped him think level." She felt the words land the way certain words land, not as sound but as sensation, somewhere behind the sternum. She didn't answer. Walter returned to the engine. After a while she said, "Did he ever talk about me?" Walter was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I knew Bobby in the mid-1960s, which was before you were born, but I know men who love their children the way some men love their work completely, without reserve. Bobby was that kind of man. Whatever he became after I knew him, I imagine that part of him didn't change." She sat with that for a while. The garage smelled of metal and solvent and the faint damp residue of the earlier rain. And it was, she realized, almost exactly the smell of the small garage where she had grown up, the one her father kept at the back of the house, the one where the radio was always on, and the light was always warm, and there was always the sense of things being attended to, cared for, kept from disappearing. She had spent her adult life in offices that were impeccably designed and aggressively neutral. Spaces engineered to convey authority and forward motion, and she had let herself forget that the smell of a working garage on a rainy night was one of the places she had ever felt most like herself. Walter, for his part, was aware of more than he showed. He was aware that the woman sitting on the floor behind him was in the process of doing something that had nothing to do with the car, or rather, had everything to do with the car in a way that went deeper than the mechanical. He had seen this before, though not recently. The particular posture of grief that looks like practicality, the way people who have lost the most important thing organize themselves around a project that lets them be near the loss without being directly inside it. He had done it himself, in the years before he stopped doing anything at all. When he had worked 18-hour days on other people's vehicles and told himself it was dedication, told himself it was craft, and known beneath all of that it was only a way of being too tired to hear Margaret's absence in the evenings. He understood Claire Ashford. He understood her in the way that people understand each other when they have been shaped by losses that rhyme not identical, never identical, but harmonically similar, tuned to the same register of longing. He worked. He kept working. He did not say any of this, because it was not the kind of thing that needed to be said. The car was the saying of it. When the board members' calls began to accumulate that first week, 7 of them, across 4 days, from 3 different time zones, Claire's assistant forwarded each one with the subject line flagged urgent, and the body text a more elaborate version of the same message. The stock, the optics, the narrative, the urgent need for leadership visibility in the current climate. She read each one. She wrote back to each of them with the same short reply. She was handling a personal matter and would be available for a board call the following week. She was aware that this was unusual behavior for a CEO of a public company in a period of market volatility. She was also aware, in a way she had not been aware of for a long time, that there was a version of her life in which she looked back on the week she spent restoring her father's car and recognized it as the hinge on which everything else turned. She couldn't have explained that to the board. She didn't try. She went to the garage instead. On the third night, she asked Walter what had happened to the Hargrove firm after he left. He paused his work for a moment, set down the micrometer in his hand. "Continued without me," he said, "which is what good organizations do." She asked if he missed it. He thought about this with the honesty she had come to recognize as characteristic of him, the absence of reflexive reassurance, the willingness to take the question seriously. "I missed the work," he said. "I didn't miss what the work had become in that context. There's a difference between the thing itself and the situation around the thing." He picked up the micrometer again. "Your company," he said. "Is there a difference there too?" She was quiet for a moment. "There used to be less of one," she said. He nodded, as though she had confirmed something he had suspected. "That tends to happen," he said. "The better you get at the situation, the further you get from the thing." She thought about that for a long time. She thought about it while he worked, and she handed tools, and the car slowly became, beneath his attention, something closer to itself. She had started Meridian in her living room with 2 engineers and a problem she wanted to solve. The problem had been interesting. The solution had been beautiful, in the way that elegant technical solutions are beautiful, with the internal coherence of things that are right in the deepest sense rather than merely functional. She had not thought about the original problem in approximately 4 years. She had been thinking about the company instead, which was not the same thing at all. The morning the engine first ran, she called her communications director from the parking lot, while the Shelby's exhaust note was still settling in the air around her. She said, "Release a statement. Say that the CEO is taking a brief personal leave to attend to a family matter. Say that the company is in capable hands," which it was, "and that she will return the following week," which she would. Say nothing about the car. Her communications director, who had worked for her for 6 years and understood her well enough not to push, said, "Understood." Then, after a pause, "Are you okay?" Claire Ashford stood in the parking lot with the sun coming up and the engine idling behind her and said, "I think I'm getting there." She had not said anything like that in a long time. She meant it. What she did with the garage in the months that followed was not a business decision, or not primarily. She bought the property from Gary Renner at fair market value, which, given the circumstances of the negotiation, was a more generous transaction than Gary deserved. She hired an architect. She kept the working bays intact, because a place that had been a place where things were made and repaired should remain a place where things were made and repaired. She added a classroom in the former office space, and a small library of technical manuals and restoration records, and a wall where the photographs of significant vehicles would eventually hang, including a Polaroid of 2 young men grinning in front of a car on a lift, printed large and framed. The Briggs Ashford Restoration Institute opened the following spring. Walter was there. He had not committed, that morning in the parking lot, to anything beyond thinking about it, but he had thought about it. And the thing he had thought, which he told her over the phone 3 weeks later, in a conversation that was short because he was a man who did not use extra words, was this: "Margaret would have wanted me to go back. I think your father would have wanted the same." She said, "I think so too." He said, "I'll be there in the fall." He was. She still drove the Shelby on Sundays, on the coast road, when the morning was clear, and there was light on the water, and the world had not yet started asking things of her. She drove it the way her father had always said it should be driven, not carefully, not with the protective anxiety of someone preserving an investment, but fully, with the windows down and the engine given what it was made to give, which was everything. She had learned that from Walter, though he had never said it in so many words. She had learned it from watching the quality of attention that he brought to the work, not the careful withholding of someone afraid to make a mistake, but the full presence of someone who understood that the thing in front of them was worth the risk of being completely there. There are things the world calls worthless only because it has not heard the story behind them. She had thought that morning on the coast road. She still believed it. She believed it with the specificity of someone who had been in the room when a man everyone ignored said 6 words that changed the direction of a particular Tuesday, and a particular grief, and perhaps a particular life. She drove. The engine held its note. The sun came over the water. And the road went on. And the morning was, like all mornings, that follow very long nights, in the business of beginning.